The rain had not stopped since morning. It fell in a fine, persistent mist that clung to the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor, blurring the edges of the yew trees that stood like silent, grieving sentinels along the drive. Inside, the silence was of a different quality, heavier and more curated than the soft hush of the rain. It was the silence of a house in mourning, a quiet dictated by propriety and the unyielding will of Lady Beatrice Beaumont, who ruled the estate in her nephew's long absence. For Alara Vance, the silence was a familiar companion, a shroud she had worn for the better part of her 24 years. As the poor relation, the orphaned niece of Lady Beatrice's late husband, her presence in the house was a matter of charity, a fact conveyed not in words but in 1,000 subtle gestures. The way her seat at the dinner table was just beyond the main pool of candlelight, the way conversations paused when she entered a room and resumed on a different topic, the way her dresses were always a season behind, meticulously mended from the cast-offs of more fortunate cousins. She was an afterthought, a shadow dwelling in the grand halls of a life that was not her own. Her domain, such as it was, consisted of 2 places where no one else cared to venture. The first was the small, chilly room at the top of the servants' staircase where she slept. The second, her true sanctuary, was the vast, neglected conservatory at the western edge of the manor. Its glass panes were clouded with grime and cobwebs, and the air within was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. But here and there, stubbornly, life persisted. A determined spray of jasmine, a tough, waxy-leafed fern, a single pale rose that bloomed defiantly out of season. Alara spent her few free hours here, patiently coaxing these forgotten things back to life, her hands gentle in the soil, her mind blessedly empty of everything but the simple, honest work of cultivation. There was a third space, one she occupied, not for solace, but for duty. Lady Beatrice detested paperwork, and so the household accounts, a sprawling, chaotic collection of ledgers and receipts, had been unofficially delegated to Alara. She would spend long afternoons in a small anteroom off the main study, her head bent over columns of figures, her quill scratching softly in the quiet. There was a deep satisfaction in it, in bringing order to the chaos, in the clean, irrefutable logic of numbers. A shilling was always a shilling. It did not change its value based on who was holding it. In a world of shifting social sands, the ledgers were solid ground. The house was steeped in the memory of the Honorable Julian Beaumont, the Duke's younger brother, whose recent scandalous death in London had sent shockwaves through their world. Lady Beatrice spoke of it only in hushed, disapproving tones, the tragedy overshadowed by the disgrace. The Duke himself, Alistair Beaumont, had not been seen at Blackwood for months. He remained in the city, a remote and formidable figure spoken of in whispers, the bearer of a title that seemed to belong more to legend than to a living man. His absence was a palpable void, leaving the manor to the stifling reign of his aunt and the ghosts of its own past. One afternoon, seeking a misplaced bill of lading from the previous year, Alara ventured into the main library. It was a place she rarely entered. Lady Beatrice considered it the Duke's exclusive province, and even in his absence, it was to be left undisturbed. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the heavy velvet curtains. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a dry, scholarly perfume that was a world away from the damp life of the conservatory. The silence here was different, too, not the oppressive quiet of the drawing room, but the patient, waiting silence of stories untold. She ran a finger along the spines of the books on a lower shelf, her touch reverent. The scale of the room was intimidating, with shelves soaring 2 stories high, accessible only by a rolling ladder that looked both magnificent and perilous. Her task was mundane, to find a specific ledger in this sea of literature, But the atmosphere of the place settled over her, a calm she had not expected. She found the estate ledgers tucked away in a dusty alcove, a chaotic pile that offended her orderly sensibilities. With a small sigh, she knelt on the floor, pulling the heavy books toward her and beginning to sort them by year. She was so absorbed in her task, in the familiar comfort of dates and figures, that she did not hear the soft creak of the door or the quiet footsteps on the thick Persian rug. It was a voice that startled her, a low, resonant baritone that seemed to rise from the very dust of the room. "You appear to have found the heart of the chaos." Alara jumped, her hand flying to her chest. A man stood a few feet away, leaning against a bookshelf. He was tall, dressed not in the funereal black of the household, but in simple, well-worn country tweeds, his boots scuffed with mud. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a smudge of dust on his cheek. She had never seen him before. Her mind raced through the possibilities. A new estate manager, a secretary sent from London to finally impose order on the Duke's affairs. He certainly did not carry the air of a guest. She rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her gray wool skirt. "I beg your pardon. I did not realize anyone was here." Her voice was softer than she intended, accustomed to being unheard. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It did not quite reach his eyes, which were a startlingly clear gray, the color of the sky before a storm. They held a deep, unnerving weariness. "The room is large enough for two, I should think. Are you attempting to make sense of that mess?" He gestured with his chin toward the pile of ledgers at her feet. Assuming him to be a fellow employee, Alara felt a small spark of kinship, a shared purpose in the face of aristocratic disarray. Her usual reserve loosened. "I am. It seems no one has properly cataloged them in a decade. The system is illogical." "Illogical," he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. He pushed himself off the bookshelf and walked closer, his gaze falling on the open book in her hands. He looked not at the figures, but at her fingers, long and slender, tracing a single column with an innate confidence. My late uncle had his own logic. He believed that if a thing was difficult to find, it was less likely to be stolen. "An interesting theory," Alara noted, her tone dry. "It seems equally effective at preventing it from being used for any practical purpose whatsoever." A real smile touched his lips this time, a brief, surprising flash of warmth. The weariness in his eyes receded for a moment. He had expected a startled curtsy, a flustered apology for her presence. He had not expected an opinion. He had not expected truth. For weeks in London, he had been surrounded by cloying sympathy and grasping opportunism, a world of whispers and angled glances. This woman, with dust on her sleeve and a forthright opinion on accounting, was like a sudden draft of clean, cold air. "You are," he began, his voice trailing off as he realized he did not know how to ask without revealing his own identity. "Miss Vance," she supplied simply. "I am companion to Lady Beatrice." She said the words with a practiced neutrality that revealed nothing of the 1,000 daily humiliations the position entailed. "And you are the new secretary, I presume? From Mr. Abernathy's office in London?" He paused for a fraction of a second. It would be so easy to correct her, to state his name and title and watch as the candor in her expression was replaced by the fearful deference he so despised. But he found, to his own surprise, that he did not want to. He wanted another moment of this, of being just a man with dust on his cheek, talking to a woman with an opinion. "Something of the sort," he said, the evasion feeling more honest than his own name would have. "I've been tasked with beginning the long process of putting the Duke's affairs in order." "Then you have your work cut out for you," Alara said, turning back to the ledgers. "If you intend to start here, I would suggest a chronological approach. Cross-referencing receipts by supplier will be the greatest challenge. The previous steward had an unfortunate habit of filing them by color. He watched her, this quiet, unassuming woman who had just given him an order in his own library. He felt a strange sense of dislocation, as if he had stepped out of his own life and into a different, simpler one. "Thank you for the advice, Miss Vance." "It is not advice," she corrected gently, not looking up from her work. "It is merely a statement of fact." Alistair Beaumont, the 8th Duke of Blackwood, stood in the silent, dusty library of his ancestors and felt for the first time in a very long time entirely and utterly seen. Not as a title, not as a source of wealth or power, but as a man who had been given a simple, honest assessment of a problem. He had come home seeking refuge from the world, and instead, in this forgotten room, he had found something far rarer, a conversation without artifice. He decided in that moment to let the deception stand. He wanted to know what other truths Miss Vance might be willing to share. The library became their unspoken meeting place. Alara would arrive each afternoon, ostensibly to continue her work on the household accounts, and he would be there, poring over estate maps or reading quietly in a worn leather armchair by the unlit hearth. He never called himself the secretary again, nor did she ask. They settled into a comfortable fiction, two people tasked with creating order from the neglect of others. Theirs was a quiet companionship, built more on shared silence than on extensive conversation. The vast room seemed to shrink around them, becoming a world of its own, insulated from the rest of the manor. He would watch her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, the tip of her tongue sometimes caught between her teeth. He noticed the way she mended the spines of the most damaged ledgers with a pot of glue and strips of linen, her movements precise and careful. It was the same care he had seen her give to a struggling rosebush in the conservatory, a tenderness that seemed at odds with the rigid logic of her accounting. She possessed a stillness he found himself craving, a centeredness that stood in stark contrast to the restless grief and anger that churned within him. Their conversations were rarely personal. They spoke of crop rotation, of the new wool prices, of a leaky roof in the east wing. He would pose hypothetical questions about estate management, and she would answer with a practicality that was as refreshing as it was astute. If one had a tenant whose harvest failed, he might ask, tracing a line on a map, would it be wiser to forgive his rent for a season or to offer him a loan for new seed? Alara would look up from her columns, her gaze direct. It would be wisest to discover why his harvest failed. Was it blight? Poor soil? Idleness? Forgiving the rent solves today's problem. Understanding the cause prevents the same problem next year. A loan for seed is useless if the land itself is soured. He would nod slowly, absorbing the simple, profound wisdom of it. The world he knew operated on grand gestures and political calculations. Her world was grounded in roots and causes, in the fundamental truth of things. He began to bring her small, anonymous gifts. A book of poetry by a little-known author he thought she might appreciate, left on the table beside her inkwell. A perfect pearlescent seashell for her desk, a relic from a distant shore. A rare orchid, pilfered from one of the heated greenhouses the head gardener kept locked, which he left one morning on the threshold of the conservatory. He never acknowledged them, and she never mentioned them, but she would place the shell where the light caught it, and he would see the book tucked into her work basket, its spine already gently broken. These silent exchanges became a language of their own, a fragile bridge being built across the chasm of their supposed stations. One late afternoon, as the light outside began to fade to a bruised purple, they were both working at the large central table, the scent of beeswax from Alara's polishing cloth hanging in the air. A sudden gust of wind rattled the tall library windows, and a loose sheaf of papers on a high shelf was dislodged, scattering to the floor. They both knelt to retrieve them, their hands moving among the scattered pages. He reached for a final, errant sheet of accounts, just as she did. His fingers brushed against hers. It was the briefest of contacts, skin against skin, but a jolt went through Alara, sharp and unexpected. His hand was warm, the touch surprisingly firm. She snatched her own hand back as if burned, a flush rising in her cheeks. In her world, such contact was unheard of, an intimacy reserved for family, for husbands and wives. She was a companion, a shadow, a creature of the background. She was not meant to be touched. He froze, his hand still hovering in the air where hers had been. He looked at her, his gray eyes unreadable in the dimming light. The air between them thickened, suddenly charged with all the things they had never said. The fiction of the secretary and the companion trembled, threatening to collapse. He could feel the frantic pulse in his own wrist, a wild, unfamiliar sensation. For weeks he had maintained a careful distance, observing her, learning the rhythms of her quiet existence. He had told himself he was intrigued by her mind, by her integrity. But in that fleeting, accidental touch, a different truth was laid bare. A truth that was far more dangerous and far more compelling. He slowly withdrew his hand and gathered the last of the papers, his movements stiff. "My apologies," he murmured, his voice deeper than usual. "It is nothing," Alara whispered, rising quickly and turning away, busying herself with straightening a pile of books that were already perfectly aligned. But it was not nothing. It was a crack in the careful facade of her life, a glimpse of a feeling so potent it frightened her. The quiet order of her world, the simple logic of her ledgers, had been disrupted. And she found, to her profound dismay, that she did not entirely wish for it to be restored. The library, once a sanctuary of peaceful work, now held a low, resonant hum of possibility, a silent question mark that lingered long after he had bid her a quiet good evening and left her alone with the gathering shadows. The fragile peace of their library world was shattered by the arrival of Lord Frederick Beaumont. He descended upon Blackwood like a foul weather front, all polished surfaces and cutting draughts. As the Duke's cousin and, until Alistair produced an heir, the next in line for the title, Frederick moved through the world with an unearned confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, his smiles thin, his compliments edged with a subtle mockery that left the recipient feeling vaguely insulted. He embodied everything Alistair had fled London to escape. The superficial charm, the casual cruelty, the relentless jockeying for position. Frederick's presence immediately altered the atmosphere of the manor. The quiet, grieving stillness was replaced by a brittle energy. He filled the halls with loud conversation and unsolicited opinions, treating the staff with a dismissive contempt that made Alara's blood run cold. He viewed Blackwood not as a home, but as a prize, his birthright temporarily held by a reclusive, grief-stricken cousin who, in Frederick's opinion, was failing in his duties. His attention fell upon Alara within an hour of his arrival. He saw her at luncheon, a silent figure in gray at the far end of the table, and dismissed her with a single, sweeping glance. To him, she was merely part of the furniture, and insignificant furniture at that. It was only when he saw her speaking with the man he knew only as the Duke's new secretary from London that a flicker of cruel interest was ignited. He could not abide any part of his cousin's life being outside his understanding or control. "You seem to have found a friend in the ink-stained fellow, Miss Vance," he remarked one evening at dinner, his voice carrying easily across the table. Lady Beatrice looked up, her expression one of mild surprise. Alistair, seated beside her, stiffened almost imperceptibly. Alara kept her eyes on her plate. "Mr. Graves and I are both tasked with organizing the estate archives. Our work often overlaps." She used the name Alistair had supplied to the staff, a common enough name that invited no scrutiny. "Graves," Frederick repeated, savoring the name with a small, unpleasant smile. "How fitting. He does have the look of an undertaker. You must find it dreadfully dull, all those dusty books. A woman of your situation must crave a bit more excitement." The implication was clear. A poor relation should be grateful for any attention, even his own, and not waste her time with servants. "I find a great deal of satisfaction in my work, my lord," Alara replied, her voice even. Alistair placed his fork down with a quiet click that was louder than a shout in the tense silence. "Miss Vance's work is invaluable to the running of this estate," he said, his voice dangerously level. He did not look at Alara, but she felt the force of his statement as if it were a shield. Frederick merely raised an eyebrow, amused by the secretary's impertinence. "Of course, invaluable." He let the word hang in the air, dripping with sarcasm, before turning the conversation to London gossip, effectively dismissing both Alara and the man who had defended her. The antagonism escalated. Frederick seemed to take a perverse pleasure in creating small, public humiliations for Alara. He would ask her to fetch him a glass of sherry, as if she were a housemaid. He would interrupt her when she spoke, turning to another guest with a theatrical sigh of boredom. His campaign of subtle cruelties culminated at a small dinner party Lady Beatrice hosted for the local gentry. It was a stuffy, formal affair, and Alara felt more out of place than ever in her best dress, a pale blue silk that had been her mother's, altered so many times it seemed to hold the memory of every frugal year. During a lull in the conversation, Frederick turned to her, his voice pitched for all to hear. "Miss Vance, I was just telling our vicar about my cousin's rather eccentric new secretary. You spend a great deal of time with him in the library, I hear. Is it true the Duke has him sleeping in the West Wing? It seems a rather grand accommodation for a man of his station." The table fell silent. All eyes turned to Alara. She felt the heat rise in her face, a painful, prickling blush. He was not just insulting her. He was implying an impropriety, a clandestine affair with a servant, a stain on the honor of the household. She could feel Alistair's gaze on her from across the table, intense and furious. She knew he was on the verge of speaking, of shattering his own disguise and bringing the entire evening to a crashing halt. But she also knew that if he did so, the scandal would be immense, and she would be at its center. Drawing on a reserve of strength she did not know she possessed, Alara met Frederick's malicious gaze. She gave him a small, cool smile. "The West Wing has been largely unused for years, my lord. I believe the Duke is simply a practical man. It makes little sense to heat rooms in the servants' quarters when there are perfectly good ones standing empty. As for my time in the library, the estate records are extensive. It takes 2 people to make any real progress. I am sure the Duke will be pleased with how efficiently his instructions are being carried out." She delivered the words with a perfect, unshakable composure. She had not been flustered. She had not been defensive. She had answered his insinuation with simple, irrefutable logic, framing everything as a matter of ducal efficiency. She had turned his own weapon back on him, subtly reminding him that they were all, including him, merely subjects of the Duke's will. A murmur of approval went around the table. The vicar nodded sagely. Frederick was left momentarily speechless, his attack neutralized. He gave a tight, angry smile and quickly changed the subject. But the damage was done. Alara felt as though she were encased in ice, her dignity a thin, fragile shell. She endured the rest of the dinner in a state of numb misery, aware of Alistair's eyes on her, his silence now feeling less like a protection and more like a weight. The quiet world of the library, their shared sanctuary, had been breached and poisoned by the ugliness of the world outside, and she knew, with a sinking certainty, that things could never go back to the way they were. Frederick, thwarted in his attempt to socially cripple Alara, turned his ambition to a more tangible target, the estate itself. He saw Alistair's grief-induced seclusion as weakness, an opportunity to assert his own influence and control. His chosen battlefield was the one place Alara felt most competent: the account books. He began to spend his mornings in the study, ostensibly to familiarize himself with his cousin's burdens, poring over the ledgers with a feigned diligence that set Alara's teeth on edge. He would ask her pointed questions, his tone laced with suspicion, challenging entries and questioning expenditures. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, a day as gray and damp as any other. Alistair had been called away to a neighboring estate to consult on a boundary dispute, a rare absence from the manor. It was the opening Frederick had been waiting for. He summoned Alara to the main study, where Lady Beatrice was already seated, her expression stern and troubled. "Miss Vance," Frederick began, foregoing any pleasantries. He stood before the large oak desk, a single ledger open before him. "I have been reviewing the quarterly accounts, and I have discovered a most alarming discrepancy. A significant sum, £500, has been disbursed without a corresponding invoice or receipt. It is recorded simply as Tenant Relief Fund, with your signature authorizing the withdrawal." Alara's heart began to beat a heavy, painful rhythm against her ribs. She knew the entry well. "The funds were for the families of the North Pasture," she explained, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "After the summer floods destroyed their crops, Mr. Graves authorized it. He said it was the Duke's wish." "Mr. Graves?" Frederick scoffed, sharing a look with Lady Beatrice. "A secretary, authorizing a disbursement of £500 on the Duke's supposed wish, without a single piece of official documentation? Aunt, you must see how this looks." Lady Beatrice's gaze on Alara was cold with disappointment. "Alara, you have overstepped your authority in the most grievous way. You are a companion, not the estate bursar. You have allowed yourself to be manipulated by a servant, and in doing so, you have exposed this household to accusations of mismanagement or worse." "Worse?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Theft," Frederick supplied, his voice smooth as silk. "The sum is precise. The documentation is non-existent, a clever little scheme between a social climbing companion and a grasping secretary. You must admit the narrative is quite compelling. The accusation hung in the air, vile and suffocating." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She had dedicated herself to this work with an almost monastic devotion. Her integrity was the one thing she owned, the one part of herself that could not be diminished by her social standing. To have it questioned, to be accused of such a base crime, was a wound deeper than any public slight. "I have never stolen a penny in my life," she said, the words stark in the quiet room. "Mr. Graves assured me the Duke had given his express permission." "And we have only your word for that, do we not?" Frederick countered. "The word of a woman with nothing to her name, who suddenly finds herself in a position of trust with the household finances. It is a classic tale." It was at that moment that the study door opened. Alistair stood on the threshold, his riding coat spattered with mud, his face grim. He had returned earlier than expected. He took in the scene in an instant. Alara, pale and trembling, his aunt, rigid with disapproval, and his cousin, standing behind the desk like a prosecutor at a trial, a look of triumph on his face. "What is the meaning of this?" Alistair's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Frederick's triumphant expression faltered for only a second before he regrouped, seizing the opportunity to expose the fraud directly to the Duke. "Alistair, thank heavens you've returned. I'm afraid I have uncovered a rather sordid situation. It seems your Miss Vance, in collusion with your new secretary, has been helping herself to the estate's funds." He explained the situation, embellishing it with insinuations about Alara's ambition and Graves's mysterious influence. Alistair listened without expression, his gray eyes fixed on his cousin. When Frederick had finished, a heavy silence descended. Alistair walked slowly into the room, peeling off his gloves finger by finger. He did not look at Alara, and in that moment, her heart broke. He was the Duke. He would believe his family. The quiet man from the library was gone, replaced by this cold, powerful stranger. She had been a fool, a naive, trusting fool, and this was to be her punishment. "You have done some impressive work, cousin," Alistair said, his voice soft. He walked to the desk and looked down at the open ledger. "You found the one entry I hoped you would." Frederick looked confused. "I don't understand." "No," Alistair said, finally lifting his gaze to meet his cousin's. "You don't. You see, I was the one who instructed Miss Vance to make that entry precisely as she did. I was the one who told her to sign for it. I was also the one who told her my name was Graves." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Lady Beatrice gasped. Frederick's face went white. Alara simply stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. The secretary. The quiet man. The Duke. They were one and the same. The kindness, the shared moments, the tentative connection she had dared to nurture. It had all been a lie, a deception, a game played by an aristocrat at the expense of a foolish companion. The humiliation of Frederick's accusation was nothing compared to this. This was a betrayal that hollowed her out from the inside. "I am Mr. Graves," Alistair continued, his voice hardening as he turned his full attention to Frederick. "And I did give the order for the tenant relief fund, an order you yourself argued against, cousin, when I proposed it in a letter from London. You felt it would set a dangerous precedent of charity. I wanted to see if your greed was greater than your memory. I wanted to see if you would use this manufactured discrepancy to discredit the one person in this house who has shown more integrity in a single day than you have in your entire life." He looked at Alara then, and for the first time she saw not the Duke and not the secretary, but a man in profound pain. There was apology in his eyes, a desperate plea for understanding. But she couldn't meet his gaze. The room was spinning. She felt like a pawn in a game she had never even known she was playing. Her competence, her honesty, they had not been valued. They had been used as a test for another man's character. "Get out," Alistair said to Frederick, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. "Pack your things! I want you gone from Blackwood by nightfall." Frederick, exposed and defeated, stammered a protest, but withered under the Duke's cold fury. He threw a look of pure hatred at Alara and then stormed from the room. Lady Beatrice, her face a mask of shock and dawning comprehension, rose and followed him, leaving Alistair and Alara alone in the suddenly vast and silent study. "Alara," he began, taking a step toward her. "Miss Vance, I can explain." But she held up a hand, stopping him. She could not bear his proximity, could not bear the pity she saw in his eyes. The sense of betrayal was a physical sickness rising in her throat. She turned without a word and fled, leaving him standing alone amidst the ruins of their quiet, secret world. She did not run to the conservatory, her usual refuge. She ran to her small, cold room, the only place that had ever truly been hers, and locked the door. That evening, the manor was electric with tension. Lord Frederick had departed in a flurry of rage, his carriage wheels spitting gravel on the drive. Lady Beatrice had retired to her chambers with a sick headache, leaving the formal dinner to be presided over by a duke who seemed more a specter than a man. The local gentry, who had been invited days before, arrived to a house shrouded in a palpable, unspoken drama. Alara had intended to remain in her room, pleading illness, but a firm message from Lady Beatrice, delivered by a maid, had made it clear that her attendance was not a request. To be absent would only fuel the gossip that was surely already smoldering. She descended the grand staircase, feeling as though she were walking to her own execution. She had chosen her plainest dress, a dark gray muslin, a color that matched her mood and her desire to be invisible. But as she entered the drawing room, she knew that invisibility was no longer an option. All eyes were on her. She was the companion at the center of the storm, the reason for Lord Frederick's sudden, shocking departure. She could feel the whispers slithering around the room, the curious, pitying, and condemnatory glances. Alistair stood by the fireplace, a glass of wine untouched in his hand. When he saw her, his expression was fraught with a mixture of relief and anguish. He started toward her, but was intercepted by the vicar's wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her insatiable curiosity. Alara found a seat in a forgotten corner, her back to the wall, and prayed for the evening to end. Dinner was an excruciating affair. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long, awkward silences. Alara kept her eyes fixed on her plate, eating nothing, the food tasteless in her mouth. She was acutely aware of Alistair at the head of the table, his gaze returning to her again and again. She refused to meet it. To do so would be to acknowledge the chasm of his deception, and she did not have the strength for it. It was Sir William Croft, a portly baronet and a close associate of Frederick's, who finally gave voice to the room's unspoken thoughts. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing the attention of the table. "A great shame about your cousin's sudden departure, Your Grace," he began, his tone oozing false sympathy. "Frederick is a man of great principle. He was telling me just the other day how concerned he was for the proper management of the estate. He felt certain standards of propriety were not being met." He glanced pointedly at Alara. "One cannot be too careful, after all, about the sort of people one places in positions of trust." The insult was blatant, a public branding. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She felt herself shrinking, becoming the insignificant, penniless relation once more. This was her reality. The library had been a dream, and now she was awake, and the world was as cruel as it had always been. Before anyone could respond, Alistair placed his hands flat on the table and rose slowly to his feet. A profound silence fell over the room. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a cold, controlled fire. He did not look at Sir William. He looked at each and every guest, one by one, his gaze lingering until they squirmed in their seats, and then his eyes came to rest on Alara. "Sir William is correct," Alistair began, his voice calm and clear, resonating in the stillness. "One cannot be too careful about the people one trusts. My cousin Frederick, for instance, is a man who trusts only in the power of a title and the weight of a purse. He measures a person's worth by the quality of their coat and the connections of their family. By that metric, he is a man of substance. By that metric, Miss Vance here is a person of no consequence." He paused, letting the words sink in. Alara's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his. She saw no pity there now, only a fierce, unwavering conviction. "But that is the metric of a fool," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "It is the currency of a shallow and bankrupt world. I have spent the last months in that world, surrounded by men like my cousin and Sir William. Men who speak of principle while practicing deceit, who speak of honor while engaging in slander. I came back to Blackwood seeking something real. I did not expect to find it." He turned his body slightly, addressing the room, but speaking only to her. "For weeks, I have had the privilege of observing Miss Vance. Not as a duke, but as a man she believed to be her equal in station. I have seen her work when no one was watching. I have seen her kindness to tenants, her patience with children, her unyielding honesty in matters great and small. I have seen her treat a secretary with the same quiet respect she affords a duke. Miss Vance's character is not something she wears like a coat to impress society. It is the very fiber of her being. Her integrity is worth more than every acre of this estate. Her honesty is a rarer jewel than anything in the family vaults. You speak of propriety, Sir William? She is the most proper person in this room, for she is the only one who is entirely, unapologetically herself." He picked up his wine glass, not to drink, but to hold it as if it were a gavel. My cousin is gone because he attempted to destroy a woman of impeccable honor to advance his own ambition. He failed. Let me be clear to everyone here tonight. An insult to Miss Vance is an insult to me. Her judgment in the running of this estate is my judgment. Her place in this house is beside me. If anyone finds these terms unacceptable, the doors of Blackwood are, as you can see, quite wide. Feel free to use them. He set the glass down. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Sir William Croft sputtering into his napkin. No one moved. No one spoke. Alistair had not merely defended her, he had redrawn the entire social map of their world, placing her, the quiet companion, at its very center. He had publicly, unequivocally, and magnificently chosen her. He had sacrificed his cousin, defied his peers, and laid his own heart bare to validate her worth. In that moment, the sting of his deception dissolved, washed away by the overwhelming power of his public truth. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the Duke, not the secretary, but Alistair. A man who had seen her, all of her, and found her worthy. Later that night, the house was finally still. The last of the stunned guests had departed, leaving behind a trail of shocked whispers. Alara had escaped the drawing room as soon as was polite, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. She found herself, without conscious thought, drawn to the conservatory. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of wet earth and night-blooming jasmine. The moonlight filtered through the grimy glass, casting ethereal patterns on the stone floor. It felt like the only real place in the world. She was tracing the edge of a fern leaf when she heard his footsteps behind her. She did not turn. Her heart was beating too fast, a wild bird trapped in her chest. "I owed you the truth," Alistair said, his voice quiet in the enclosed space. "In public. After the lie I allowed you to believe in private." She still could not look at him. "Why?" she whispered. "Why the deception? The game?" He moved to stand beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. He looked out at the moonlit, tangled garden within the glass walls. It did not begin as a game. It began as a moment of cowardice. When you mistook me for a secretary, I was relieved. My brother Julian, he was destroyed by our world, by the whispers, the expectations, the constant performance of being a Beaumont. They judged him, they gossiped about him, and when he stumbled, they devoured him. I came back here so weary of the title, of being the Duke. It felt like a cage. When you spoke to me so plainly, without a trace of deference, you weren't speaking to the Duke. You were speaking to a man, and I have not felt like a man in a very long time. He finally turned to face her, and in the pale light, she could see the profound grief etched around his eyes. This was his private confession, the truth behind the wounded weariness she had first seen in him. The longer it went on, he continued, his voice rough with emotion, the more I dreaded ending it. In the library, I was not the Duke of Blackwood. I was just Alistair. And you were not Lady Beatrice's poor relation. You were Alara. You were brilliant and honest, and you saw things so clearly. I was selfish. I wanted to keep that world, our world, for as long as I could. "You used me," she said, the words tasting of accusation, though the heat had gone out of them. "You used my work to test your cousin." "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. "I did, and it is the most dishonorable thing I have ever done. I knew Frederick's nature, and I put you in his path to prove it. I can only say that in my arrogance, I believed I could protect you from the consequences. I was wrong. I exposed you to his cruelty and to public humiliation. I have no excuse. I can only ask for your forgiveness." She was silent for a long time, the scent of jasmine filling the space between them. She thought of the lonely years, the quiet invisibility, the ache of being perpetually overlooked. Then she thought of the library, the shared silence, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in her life. He had deceived her, yes, but he had also listened to her. He had valued her mind, and tonight he had honored her soul in front of the entire world. "There is nothing to forgive," she said at last, her voice soft but firm. She finally turned to meet his gaze. "You did not see a poor companion, and I did not see a secretary. I saw a man who was lonely and who understood the value of order in a chaotic world." A look of profound relief washed over his features. He took a hesitant step closer, his hands clenched at his sides, as if restraining himself from reaching for her. "Alara," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "What I said at dinner. It was not a performance. It was the truest thing I have ever said. This house is not a home. It is a collection of stone and duty. My title is a burden I have carried alone. I do not want to be alone anymore. I don't want a duchess who will play the social games and host the right parties. I want a partner. I want someone who will tell me the truth, even when it is difficult. I want someone who understands that the foundation of this estate is not its name, but its people, its soil. I want you." He took another step, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. "I am not asking the companion to become a duchess. I am asking Alara Vance if she will do me the greatest honor of all and consent to be my wife." The world seemed to stop. The rain had started again, a soft patter on the glass roof of the conservatory, a gentle percussion to the frantic beating of her own heart. He was not offering her a title or wealth or security. He was offering her partnership. He was offering her himself, the lonely man from the library. He was asking for her, the quiet woman who loved books and broken things. She thought of the society that had dismissed her, the family that had tolerated her, the world that had told her in 1,000 ways that she had nothing of value, and she looked at this powerful, wounded man who believed she was everything. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had allowed herself in years. It felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. "Alistair Beaumont," she said, testing his name on her tongue. "I believe I would like that very much." He closed the distance between them then, and when he took her hands in his, there was no hesitation. His touch was not accidental, not fleeting. It was a promise, a firm, warm, and deeply intentional anchor in the turning world. And in the quiet, moonlit conservatory, surrounded by the stubborn, persistent life she had so lovingly nurtured, Alara Vance, who had been told she had nothing, finally accepted that she was about to have it all. Their wedding was a quiet affair, held not in the suffocating grandeur of London, but in the small, ancient chapel on the grounds of Blackwood. The guests were few, the tenants of the estate, the household staff, and a stunned Lady Beatrice, who, having witnessed the depth of her nephew's resolve, had offered a grudging but sincere blessing. She saw in Alara not a social climber, but a woman of substance who had, against all odds, healed a hurt in her nephew she had believed to be permanent. Frederick was not mentioned. His name, like his presence, had been excised from Blackwood. Alara wore a simple gown of ivory silk, and in her hair she wore a single, perfect white rose from the conservatory. As Alistair slid the simple gold band onto her finger, he leaned in and whispered, so only she could hear, "My truth." And she knew he did not mean the vows, but her. The years that followed were a quiet revolution. The great love story of the Duke of Blackwood and his unremarkable Duchess was not one of grand passions played out on a public stage. It was a story written in the margins, in the steady, daily accumulation of small gestures and shared duties. It was found in the way he would seek her out in the afternoons, no longer in the dusty library, but in the now thriving conservatory, to discuss the day's events, It was in the way her hand would instinctively find his as they walked the fields, surveying the crops. It was in the shared silence as they sat before the fire in the library, now a warm, lived-in heart of the home, their children sleeping peacefully upstairs. Ilara, the Duchess of Blackwood, did not transform into a society belle. She did not host glittering balls or cultivate the friendships of the fashionable. Instead, she cultivated the estate. With Alistair at her side, she poured her intelligence and integrity into the land and its people. They established a school for the tenants' children. They implemented new farming techniques that brought prosperity to the region. The ledgers, once a symbol of her solitary work, became their joint project. The story of their shared life written in columns of income and expenditure, of investments in people and harvests of community. The household accounts now included a permanent and significant tenant relief fund. Society at first was scandalized, then it was intrigued, finally it was awed. The Blackwood estate, once seen as a place of stagnant grief, became a model of prosperity and progressive management. People spoke of the Duke's brilliance, but those who knew, those who lived and worked on the land, spoke of the Duchess. They spoke of her quiet wisdom, her fairness, her uncanny ability to see the root of a problem. They said the Duke had chosen the finest steward in all of England to be his wife. One cool autumn evening, many years into their marriage, Alistair found Ilara in the library, a sleeping child nestled in her lap, a book open in her free hand. The firelight danced on the warm wood of the shelves and caught the silver threads that had begun to appear in her hair. He came and knelt before her chair, his hand resting on her knee. He was no longer the haunted, weary man she had first met. The lines of grief around his eyes had been softened by years of peace and quiet joy. He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the architect of his contentment. He remembered the whispers from all those years ago, the cruel dismissals from people like his cousin. They said she had nothing to offer him, a woman with no fortune, no connections, no dazzling beauty. They saw an empty vessel. He saw the truth. He leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "I was just thinking," he murmured against her skin, his voice filled with a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "About what a poor match they all thought we were." Ilara smiled, her eyes not leaving the page of her book. "And what have you concluded?" "I've concluded," he said, his hand tightening gently on her knee, a familiar grounding touch, "that I am the one who can't leave. You are the foundation of this house, Ilara. You are the truth I live by." She finally looked up from her book, her gaze meeting his over the head of their sleeping child. In her eyes, he saw not the Duchess of Blackwood, but the quiet, competent woman with dust on her sleeve who had looked at him without artifice and told him simply how to bring order to the chaos. She had been doing it ever since. The rain had long since stopped, and in the warm, quiet library, surrounded by the life they had built together, the Duke of Blackwood knew he was finally, truly home.